You're not real. Wait, am I real? Am I just a figment of your imagination? Oh God. Hello interwebs and welcome to my review of Star Trek Picard Episode 6, The Impossible Box. I don't know why I did that. It has nothing to do with the episode. Just thought it was funny. I'm weird. Let's get moving. So, here's my spoiler-free thoughts for the episode. This episode, I think, objectively, in my opinion, is the best so far in the series. While I think Stardust City Rag worked for me personally as a huge fan of 7 of 9 and someone who kind of loves the more flamboyant side of pretty much anything that I watch, that episode worked for me personally as probably my favorite of the series. But this one, I think, just absolutely nails everything that I want out of Star Trek Picard. When I saw the previews for this episode last week, I really thought that it was going to be a much more action-focused episode, and there definitely is some excitement in this episode, but this episode moved the plot along in a really intriguing way, and yet kept it at a very slow and steady pace that gave us wonderful, wonderful scenes that revealed character. Every scene in this episode was rooted in giving us another piece of each of the characters that were in that scene. And the other thing that I also want to give real credit to is the dialogue in this episode is just so wonderful. Previous episodes have had some really great lines and beats here and there, and I've loved all those episodes for that, but almost every scene had a standout line that I was just like, wow, that is a really powerful and telling piece of dialogue. Just phenomenally written stuff here. You can definitely tell that Michael Chabon is on the writing staff. You can definitely see the novelist's touch. Was writing down great lines every time they came up, and I just kind of got overrun with how many great dialogue lines that I found in the episode. So just fantastic job on that point. And like I said, this moved the plot of the show along at a good clip. We finally are getting some pieces in place that we knew were inevitable. We knew some things were definitely going to happen that finally happened in this episode. So I'm glad that we're able to move past them, past these inevitable points in the story, and get to, next week. I really have no idea where the story is going to go after this. So I'm just kind of glad we've moved past this sort of point that we all knew was coming. There was no real surprises in the plot in this episode, to be honest, but every moment was just so textured and so well written that I just really didn't care, that I pretty much knew exactly where this episode was going to go by the end of it. The only knock that I can really say against this episode overall is there are a few moments here and there that would have rang much stronger had they been set up a little bit better in previous episodes. And that's not really a fault of this episode, it's just a fault of the setup going into this episode. I'm thinking specifically of everything between Narek and Soji. The stuff between Narek and Soji this episode was really well done, but it didn't land as hard as I would have liked just because I wasn't really as invested in their relationship up until this point. Like I said, again, phenomenally well done within this episode, but because that relationship hasn't really struck the chord that I think the writers were trying to get us to, it didn't really hit as hard as it could have in this episode. But again, not a fault of the writing of this episode, just a writing of maybe the episodes that came prior to this one. So that's really the only major knock that I can just kind of think of right off the top of my head in a spoiler-free mode. So those are my spoiler-free thoughts on The Impossible Box. So if you haven't seen The Impossible Box, stop here, go watch the episode, come back when you're done, because we're going to go through everything scene by scene, and I'm just going to give you all of my thoughts. Also, before we get started on the scene-by-scene breakdown, I just want to tell all of you thank you so much for this week. I did a video earlier this week saying thank you, and as many of you know, I was scammed out of a lot of money by some scammers earlier this week, or actually last week. I was terrified and scared, and I asked for help from all of you out there in the audience, and you made me feel so loved and welcomed, and you gave me financial help, but even more importantly, and not that financial help isn't important because it is so incredibly helpful. But the emotion and the kindness and generosity and wonderful words of support that I got from all of you out there just was truly meaningful. And I cannot express enough how meaningful it all was to me. And again, the financial help is also super appreciated. But what I'm going to hold on to and what's going to be memorable for me is just the showing of kindness and support that I got from so many people out there. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to be doing another video in a few weeks, just to sort of give an update on that situation and that side of things, as well as some positive things going into my surgery and discussing that side of things. So it's not all going to be about sort of the scammer stuff, but I also want to make sure, just so everyone knows, I want to be as transparent and open as possible throughout this whole process, especially because of the financial help that all of you gave me. So I want to make sure that I am being responsible and transparent and open as I possibly can throughout the situation, because I feel the responsibility that you have given me with your show of support. So just want to make sure you guys all know that will be happening in the next few days once everything sort of solidifies and I'm at a good spot where I can sort of talk about all the events on my end of things. It's mostly just police reports and dealing with the bank, but I just at least want to keep everyone updated on that side of things as best I can. All right, well, enough about me and my personal life. Let's talk about Star Trek Picard. All right, this episode opens up on Soji's dream. I really loved the horror vibe of Soji's dreams in this episode, and I especially loved that the window was a cube, sort of reiterating this theme of the impossible box that carries throughout the entire episode. And there's so many different things that could be described as the impossible box, by the way. I'll sort of talk about this up front about how much I love this title. Is the impossible box Soji? She's, filled with so much information and contradictions. Is the impossible box the Borg Cube? Is the impossible box the little box that Narek is playing around with? Is the impossible box sort of like the trauma that Picard's dealing with? Such a wonderful, evocative title that sort of you can really ask, what is the impossible box? Just really, really great title there. And then when Soji wakes up, we sort of get the sexy bedtime Narek scene. And this is one of those moments I was talking about earlier that really didn't read as well, and kind of everything with Narek and Soji is really well done in this episode, but just doesn't read as well as it could have, given that I didn't really care about the relationship beforehand. So this like sexy banter stuff in the bedroom didn't really work for me as much, because I was kind of like, I don't really care. But the episode started to make me care about the relationship, with learning how much Soji is starting to trust Narek. Like, she's asking about his true name and kind of playing around with him and like talking about this stuff. And you just see all the small manipulations that Narek is doing in every single scene. He just keeps pushing her just a little bit more in every scene. And he really is clever in those aspects. And I really love the writing of that, because you just sort of see the knife slowly turning in Soji without her even noticing it. It's how he's just slowly pushing her in every little bit, and how he's getting her to trust him, and how he's kind of pushing her to like recognize her cognitive dissonance that he mentions later. Just phenomenally well written, subtle storytelling between these two characters throughout this episode in those senses. Like, for example, in this scene, he asks her about her mom AI. He asks her about, is your dream a memory? Is it something that you are coming up with? Again, just small, subtle hints that he's just pushing her in interesting ways. Then back on the La Sirena, we get a scene between Jurati and Picard and Elnor, where Jurati reveals that, Maddox died, and she's obviously lying and saying, he died from, heart failure based on his injuries, and Picard kind of taking that on the nose a little bit, taking that at face value a little bit. I also really loved the rest of this scene where we sort of get the reminder of Picard's trauma and time with the Borg, the mention of the Borg Cube. And again, here's one of those wonderful lines that I really loved. The Borg, they don't change, they metastasize. Such a wonderful, wonderful line from Picard there, and just really showing his view of the Borg that will evolve over the course of this episode. Just great writing to just bring us from beginning to end in Picard's character. I also really liked Elnor's beats here. I'm going to have more to say about Elnor by the end of the episode, but I do like the small beats and moments that we get with Elnor sprinkled throughout this episode. Like, I loved him getting butt in or in butt messed up and backwards. I also really liked sort of him, reacting and sort of speaking candidly as he does, and sort of pushing people's emotions out. It works well to sort of generate exposition for the viewers who may not know much about Picard's history, but also plays into their character. And that's something this show just does phenomenally well, mixing character moments with exposition. Just great job. Then we get a quick scene of Picard on the holodeck. I really loved that he took a moment to catch his breath. You sort of see his lingering trauma and his trepidation at having to go back on the Borg Cube. And then the scene ends on such a wonderful moment where he's looking at old photos of the Borg Reclamation Project, and he has a nice kind of very kind reaction at seeing Hugh's face. It was a great, like, sort of small beat where he just sees Hugh's face and sort of reacts positively to that, sort of quickly reminding us that these two characters have a history. It was a small character beat, but again, gave us exposition. And then when we stop on the image of Locutus, the camera just perfectly aligning to sort of match Locutus's face with Picard's face. And it was just such an evocative and emotional shot. And I will say, and I'll be mentioning this a few times, unlike Star Trek Discovery, where I really feel like, while I do love the camera work in that show, it feels like it's just cameras moving because cameras moving, and it's just kind of doing stuff to do stuff. I felt like a lot of the camera choices in this episode were very intentionally placed, and I thought there was just some very subtle camera work being done throughout this episode, and this was one of those moments where we sort of have Picard lining up with Locutus's face. So just excellent, precise camera work throughout this episode, and I'll mention it a couple other times throughout this review. And by lining up that shot with Picard's face, we get the sense of how much Locutus and his time with the Borg still hangs over Picard. We always get the sense that Picard overcame his trauma, which you can't really always do or ever do in First Contact, but we really get the sense here that no, he still feels the trauma and fear of what Locutus and his time with the Borg did to him, and this shot just excellently portrayed that in a small, quick, subtle way. Next up, we get Rios playing soccer on the bridge of the La Sirena. I loved sort of that we're getting like bits and pieces. Again, small moments of character. Like, you don't really need to point it out too much, but just the fact that Rios plays soccer just says a lot about him and reveals a lot of his character. He's kind of playful, and he likes to work off some sweat, and also has a very attractive body, if I do say so myself. So then Jurati comes up and reveals that she's sort of dealing with the trauma of, we know that she kills Maddox, and everyone else sort of thinking that she's just upset that Maddox has died. And again, some really great lines in this scene. I loved the line where she says, "I never slept with a captain," and Rio saying, "I recommend it." Just very funny. And I liked her beat about saying, "I have a superpower. I can sense mistakes while I'm making them." And Rio saying that's a really dumb superpower. It just reveals so much about them and their playful banter, but also them as characters, and like the pain she's going through, and the fear and the worry she's going through, and the vulnerability she's feeling. Just all of that being expressed in this really wonderful, sweet scene between these two characters. And I really like that she sleeps with Rios, because I feel like that'll play very well into both of their characters. It's showing that she's vulnerable, she needs someone, she's sort of trying to find that rebound person, and when eventually I'm sure everyone's going to learn that she betrayed them, Rios is going to feel even more betrayed because he has this sort of sexual encounter with her. Then we go back to the Borg Cube, and we get a scene between Narek and his sister. Again, this is another scene that kind of reiterates previous beats from previous episodes that we know, like, oh yeah, the sister doesn't believe that Narek's methods are going to work, and Narek's sort of revealing things. It's sort of repeating that stuff, and it's, again, well written here, but again, just because I've seen it so many times in other episodes, I'm like, yeah, I get the dynamic. We can move on. And there's some great beats in this scene that I wish had been expressed earlier, like the fact that Narek plays with that box. Just reveals so much about him. Like, he uses it as a tool. She sees it as a toy. So things that she misses, he sort of sees the greater depth in it. And that's sort of how he views Soji as well. That, the sister just sees Soji as a toy, and Narek sees her as a tool, something he can manipulate, play with, and sort of reveal pieces of. Brilliantly, evocatively done. I keep using the word evocative in this review, but really well done dynamic play there, and actually using something like a thing that the actors are using to reveal character about both of them, and actually thematic plot throughout the episode. And I wish that these had been how the scenes had been done previously. I didn't need the incestuous brother-sister stuff going on in previous episodes, and it just works really well here. And I'm just kind of frustrated that it doesn't land as well, because previous episode hadn't built it up as well. Because it's just so well done in this episode. Another moment that I also wanted to mention is Narek sort of drawing attention to the fact that Soji is sort of having this battle between her mind of synth and human. And that idea of, the battle between two parts of an identity is something very, very Star Trek in nature. Spock always dealing with being half Vulcan, half human. Data being a synth and a human. Odo being a solid and, a shapeshifter. 7 of 9 dealing with being Borg and human. There's so many characters that sort of struggle with the mixture of identity. That's a very Star Trek trait, and I really like that Narek is sort of subverting that and using it to play against Soji. It's just a wonderful subversion of a typical Star Trek trope, and I like Narek kind of calling it to our attention in this scene, and how he's able to manipulate that play on identity, that very Star Trek idea within this scene and within this episode. Then back on La Sirena, we get this scene where Picard's basically saying we need to be open, we can't lie to get our way on the ship, we just say, I'm coming, and we need to get me credentials on the ship. And I like that Elnor sort of has a sense of pride in this plan because it is being truthful, and Elnor's like, yeah, doing the truthful way works. And so I like the small little beats with him where he just sort of has pride in it. And then I liked this scene with Raffi and showing how capable she is, even when she's clearly backslidden into using drugs and being drunk. So she's clearly on the downslide of being clean, but we still get the sense that she can still do her job. She's so manipulative. She's so good at working her angles. She's just so smart, but it costs her. And you get to see that cost on her. Like the fact that she's doing stuff for Picard, it costs her. It costs her so much. Gut-wrenching scene at the end when she loses her friendship and you see her struggling away and Picard clapping for her and saying yay and not taking the moment to recognize the toll that his ask is taking on her. It's again Picard kind of being blinded to the needs of his crew because he has a goal and he has a mission. And then immediately after that, we get a wonderful scene between Raffi and Rios, which I really loved, by the way, coming off of the Jurati and Rios scene because it showed how Raffi and Rios are just friends, and they're very casual friends, and I like that the fact that they are different genders doesn't necessarily play into that, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I just like seeing that they have a very platonic relationship between the two of them, and that they feel open with each other, and Raffi's sort of dealing with I missed, talking about my son, and great line from Rios where he says, no one gets it all right, Raff, and tells so much about Rios that he doesn't get everything right, and he sort of carries that weight. It's so many great lines throughout this whole episode that just reveals so much about the characters and just so beautifully written. Then back on the artifact, we get Narek telling Soji that she falls asleep for exactly 70 seconds. Again, Narek couching something in concern, but we really know he's just manipulating her. Again, I just like seeing those small, subtle twisting of the knife that Narek does to Soji throughout this episode. Then we get a scene with Soji and her mom AI, where Soji's sort of coming to realize that, yeah, she is falling asleep every time she talks to the mom AI. And again, a nice camera moment where I just like how the camera slowly, subtly just starts getting off kilter as she talks. Just again, very intentional camera work. Just shows the emotion going on in Soji's head, how she's just starting to feel more and more off kilter, both as she's falling asleep by the mom AI, but also she's sort of realizing the manipulation of her mind that's been going on. Then we get a nice quick scene on the La Sirena with Picard and Elnor, with Picard having flashback and triggers about going on the Borg Cube. Nice little beat there, and sort of showing him getting more and more anxious as we get closer and closer to the cube, and also him telling Elnor to stay on the ship, which will come up later. Then we get Soji waking up, and I really loved how she discovers that she's been lied to her whole life, that she pulls all these pictures out and she does a time chronometer thing, and she realizes they've only been around for about 3 years, and she's sort of learning how these things from her childhood could only be around 3 years. It's a clever way for her to discover that, and just a very intriguing way for her to learn about her history. Then we get Picard beaming onto the cube, and honestly I think this is one of my favorite scenes in the entire episode. The sound design in this scene was creepy and terrifying. This is the first time in this entire series of Star Trek Picard so far that the Borg Cube has felt suitably terrifying. That's been one thing that I've been kind of disappointed about with the Borg Cube, is that it's been not as scary as we know Borg Cubes can be. It should be like a haunted house, like a techno haunted house. And this is the first time where I really felt that the sound design was great. We get Picard's breath, but this sort of creepy horror sounds going on, and the flashbacks, and we get the shot of Picard as Locutus. Just all really terrifying scene that really shows the weight on Picard and the fear that he has. And then we finally get to see Hugh, and it was such a wonderful scene between the two of them where Picard sees a friendly face, it helps reorient him, and they just smile and share a hug. I thought that was such a brilliant moment, and just wonderfully acted by Patrick Stewart and Jonathan Del Arco in that moment. And I should say Patrick Stewart's acting throughout this entire scene, showing the trauma and fear and concern on Patrick Stewart's face. And throughout the rest of this episode, he just does a fantastic job. Just excellently portrayed by Patrick Stewart. And Jonathan Del Arco also does a fantastic job with Picard as well. Speaking of the scenes between Hugh and Picard here, I'm just going to talk about all of them. I really loved every scene between Hugh and Picard here. I really loved Hugh's complete understanding of Picard, saying, you've moved beyond Locutus. You're not Locutus anymore. Him completely understanding and affirming Picard's trauma and fears, but also saying you are more than that. Just the fact that Hugh is so able to empathize and understand just speaks so well to both characters and how well written both characters are. And I like Hugh saying, I'll do everything in my power to help you. But then later on, we get this wonderful scene where Hugh is showing how the Borg have been de-assimilated, how we have the ex-Borgs. And it was just a very heartwarming scene where Picard's going through and seeing the work that Hugh is doing here. Hugh is like someone who runs a soup kitchen, who's like doing the hard work that no one really acknowledges, and Picard's sort of taking the moment to understand how important Hugh's work is. And I just love the beat where you get the Borg who's getting his eye fixed, and you just see the joy in his face to finally have that like scar, that piece of himself given back to him in a way. He doesn't have his eye back, but removing some of the scars of the Borg just helps that person so much to like reorient themselves and handle their trauma a little bit better. And Picard's saying, you're not doing perfect work here, but it doesn't need to be perfect. You're doing good, important work here, Hugh. And I also really loved the discussion here where Hugh basically says, having you speak up for these people would be very meaningful. And you get the sense of like Hugh saying, hey, I'll do anything for you, but maybe you could do something for me. It speaks to his cleverness. It speaks to his intelligence. It speaks to his deep, deep caring about Borg people and the fact that they need to be seen as humans and as people. I shouldn't say humans, but as people. And they haven't always been treated like that, saying, the Romulans treat us just like the Queen did. We are slaves as well. And I loved that discussion because it also gets brought up in the sense of citizenship. Hugh is a Federation citizen because he was rescued in Federation space, but these Borg on this ship are Romulan citizens and are treated like crap because they are not given full personhood and rights under Romulan government. Bringing it into the political discussion today, that speaks very much towards our political situation. Think about how many minority groups in the United States are fighting just to be able to be recognized as citizens and have full rights under the law, despite the fact that they lived here for a very, very long time. That's a very long discussion for a featured video where I can talk about the politics of this show and how it connects to present day politics. But the discussion of citizenship is a very prescient one within this episode. And I like that it's brought up. I like that it's acknowledged. And I like that it's talked about in really deft terms. Phenomenal way to connect this show and what's happening on this show with how the Borg are treated and where they're born or where they're, resurrected or de-assimilated, I guess is the right word, speaks to how many rights they're allowed to have. It's just a really wonderful idea that shows the nuances of situations like citizenship. He was treated like a person because he's a Federation citizen. The rest of the de-assimilated Borg are not because they are not Federation citizens. It's an interesting parallel. Soji goes to Narek for help, and he takes her into a Vulcan meditation chamber, or I should say a Romulan meditation chamber. Again, him playing up him being vulnerable with her is like, this meditation is something only Romulans do, and so I'm just gonna take you through it beat by beat, and I'm gonna give you my true name. I'm gonna tell you all these things, and showing how he's so really good at manipulating her into trusting him. But then you also get the sense that he is telling her something that he's vulnerable about. Telling her his true name is something that is meaningful to him. And you see that when he tries to, spoiler, when he tries to kill her at the end, you see that does hurt him. And the fact that he tells her his true name, you see that means something to him, even though he is using it to manipulate her. So I do like that sort of double identity that he has going on within himself as well. I wish it had been portrayed better in previous episodes because it would have just hit so much harder here because it's so well written in this episode. And the other thing I should say, as we go through this sort of like meditation, like as I sort of alluded to before, I like that it kind of was very reminiscent of Vulcan meditation. We haven't really thought of Romulans as being very meditative as a species, but I like that, the look of this room and the sort of meditation practice felt very Vulcan-like in nature, and that makes sense considering that Romulans are descendants of Vulcans. It's very twisted in a Romulan way of like, it's about finding the secret at the center of yourself. It's sort of couched in those secret secretive terms, and which very much Romulan in nature, but it does have, you can see the direct line from how this meditation came from maybe a Vulcan lineage, perhaps. So I like that sort of connection there. And throughout the scene, as Narek takes Soji through the dream, again, I just like him working with her and taking steps with her, and he does things really well, like saying, maintain control, trust yourself. Your father's going to yell at you. I want you to stay with me and stay in control here, and sort of giving her that sense of control. And when it all gets taken away from her at the end, when she loses all that sense of control, it is gut-wrenching because of how much control she was finally able to exert for once in her own life, and then just immediately it goes all away, taken by the person she trusted most. Also, the image of her finding the Pinocchio wooden version of herself is just such a great evocative image. It reminds me of Data. I mean, the creators of Star Trek The Next Generation, Gene Roddenberry and everyone else, always referred to Data as Pinocchio, someone learning to be human. And so using that imagery here in sort of a dark and twisted way was a nice callback to that, but also a great way to subvert it and twist it and make it something terrifying as Soji learns that. And then when Narek says, you weren't real, you never were. It worked really well as it could be in this episode. Just phenomenal. I keep using that word, phenomenal, but this episode just so great in all these subtle character beats, and it just works so fantastically. Then Narek tries to kill Soji, and she breaks out of the meditation chamber, runs right into Picard, and Picard basically says, come with me, trust me. And I liked the tension in that moment, because you're like, will she trust him? I could see her being like, nope, I'm not trusting anybody right now, but she does. And you get the sense that he's doing that, he's able to do that because he is Picard. Picard is able to convince her even in those short few moments. Great quick beat there that sort of built up this good tension but made it work in a very quick, effective, and efficient manner. Then they get chased to the Borg Cube, and we get to go to the Queen's chamber. I think it was called the Queen's cell. And again, suitably creepy. I liked the moment where Hugh says, I've never been here, you've never been here, but it's just kind of there. And that sort of creeping sense of dread and horror. And I do wonder if there's a reason we're getting mentions of the Queen. We've sort of gotten hints of the Queen throughout this series. We saw flashes of her in Picard's sort of trauma flashbacks. We saw the Queens in the first episode with Data playing the 5 Queens. I do wonder if they're referring to the Queen repeatedly, if they're going to be bringing up the Queen in some way, shape, or form at some point in the rest of this series. So I'm curious to see why they brought that up. And I like this idea of there's this slingshot thing that the Borg Queen has that sort of shoots people out, and so Picard can go with Soji to somewhere really far away. And then here comes my only real major problem with this episode, and I was kind of disagreeing with my roommate. We were talking after we watched the episode. We kind of had a small disagreement about this, but Eleanor shows up, kills the Romulan guards that show up to attack them, and then stays behind to protect Picard as they escape. And I do like there's one line in here where Picard says, just got you back, I don't want to leave you behind again. And Eleanor says, that fills me with joy to hear you say that. Great little character beat that I think effectively shows where they're at in their relationship. But I think it, in my opinion, while I do like almost every scene that Eleanor is in, and I like the ways he is used in the small, subtle beats of revealing his character, I'm a bit frustrated. And this is my only real frustration. It's kind of sad that it happens right at the end of the episode because I want to end on a positive note. But I am frustrated that we're kind of losing him being with Picard in this moment, because I think conceptually Eleanor is a great character. This character who really has a connection with Picard, that Picard really loves and cares about, and Eleanor really loves and cares about Picard. But Eleanor kind of feels hurt that Picard abandoned him so long ago. And so there's sort of this I love you, but I'm a little bit hurt by you idea going on between the two of them. And I'm just a bit frustrated that we didn't get a little bit more of that before they got separated, because it would have made this moment read a little bit stronger for me. Because, we only met Eleanor 2 episodes ago. He didn't really do much last episode, and then already they're separated. Now, like I said, clearly they're going to get back together at some point, and there's going to be more story to mine between Eleanor and Picard. I'm guaranteeing that is going to happen. Eleanor and Picard will get back together, and there will be more story mined there. But I feel like this moment where Eleanor stays behind does not work as effectively for me, just because I haven't really gotten a sense of seeing their relationship evolve enough to make this impactful. I get what it's setting up, that like Picard and Elnor finally have reconnected, and then Elnor is getting left behind yet again. And while there is a reluctance in doing that, there's obviously going to be some emotional moments in there. But it doesn't read as well in this episode because it wasn't set up as well. And like I said, as much as I've loved previous episodes of the show, there are just moments in this episode that I think would have worked better had we had a little bit more build up to it. And this is one of those moments that for me is not a problem within this episode, but just does not read as well as it could have if it had been set up a little bit better. And I'll kind of end on this thought. And I keep saying that, like, oh, if other episodes set this up better. That's not a knock against the other episodes. I have liked a lot of what those episodes have given me, and taking those episodes on their own terms. They are phenomenal, and I've loved pretty much every single episode of Star Trek Picard. I'm just, when I say this sort of comment of, like, I wish there had been better setup for it in this episode, it's just sort of saying that, taken on their own terms, those episodes are great, but taken as a build-up to certain things that are being paid off, there's some pieces missing that I just wish were there. So it's just not a knock against those episodes, but just a knock against what's not there, if that makes any sense. I hope what I'm trying to critique here is making some semblance of sense to you out there. So yeah, so that's sort of just my one read on that last moment at the end there. And I do like that line that the episode ends on, like, choose to live. Choose to live is such a great line too. Again, so many wonderful lines. I'm kind of sad to end on a bad critique moment there. It's just like my one major knock just happens to be the end beat of the episode, so that's kind of unfortunate. But to wrap out my thoughts, objectively, this is the best episode of the show so far. Just some really wonderful character moments between all of our characters here. The stuff between Soji and Narek was so rich and dense and subtle that I really loved almost every scene between them, and that's saying something for those two, because while I've not hated their scenes, I've not found them all that intriguing so far, and everyone here was rich and deep and dense and really thoughtful throughout. And we got some really wonderful stuff, great stuff about Picard's trauma as a Borg, and then him sort of coming around to understanding that the Borg are people too, and the needs of these de-assimilated Borg, and sort of him sort of overcoming his trauma and Hugh helping him through overcoming his trauma. Some great moments between the two of them. Some prescient political metaphor going on with how the Borg are being used. And some wonderful moments between our new characters, too. The stuff between Rios and Girardi, between Rios and Raffi. Just some really great building out between their relationships, sans Picard. And I'm liking that we're investing in these characters within themselves and not just how they relate to Picard. Great, because that could be one fault of the series, that we just be like, oh yeah, everyone's just funneling through Picard and their interactions all kind of funnel through Picard. And I don't get that sense that this show is doing that. Every character is being treated with the same amount of reverence and respect as Picard is. And, you know, with such an important and mythological and sort of Star Trek history as Picard is, the fact that other characters are being given the same consideration is just, it speaks well to the deftness and the skill of all of these writers, just to trust their own creations as well as the creations of past Star Trek, that they trust their new characters just as much as they trust Picard as a character. So I really adore that. Some small nitpicks, like I said, here and there, but generally this episode was just the chef's kiss so far of Star Trek Picard. But I'd love to hear what all of you thought. Did you agree with me? Did you love this episode? Did you have problems with this episode? Did you have more problems than I did? I'd love to hear all of that down in the comments below. And if you want to help make this channel even better, just the sort of normal mantra, please consider giving to my Patreon or my PayPal. Every little bit helps pay the bills. It'll help pay for my upcoming surgery. And like I said, I'm just so thankful for the financial support and giving and thoughtfulness and caring and kindness that you have all shown me this week. It's really meant the world to me. So thank you to all of you out there. But regardless of if you subscribe or if you comment or if you give, I am just so thankful that you stopped by, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, Stefan Schuhart, BBD, Boyd and Marybeth Earl, Michael McGee, Lal Lindley, Wellington Marcus, Munir Amlani, Mari Nekar, and Marika Kuyechin.